His past self whispered through his thoughts. The harsh brutality of the northern sea meant nothing to Baek Jung-hyuk. No frozen wasteland could contain his will. But in his current life, seated on a different throne in a different world, Roman faced a different calculation entirely. The question wasn't whether he could act, it was whether he should. His attention shifted to the present crisis before him. From the moment Kaidan had arrived speaking of orcs threatening the Luna Kingdom, Roman knew this threat couldn't be ignored. Dmitry's future depended on securing alliances and demonstrating strength. Yet Roman was no fool. He had no intention of throwing lives away recklessly. There was no need for excessive risk when careful planning could achieve the same result. Roman's decision crystallized. He would accept Kaidan's proposal, but on his own terms. His gaze fell upon the Luna Kingdom's envoy, still kneeling before his throne in desperate supplication. Roman's voice rang out clear and commanding as he laid out his conditions. First, in exchange for Dmitry's military intervention, the Luna Kingdom would submit to become a vassal state under Dmitry's rule. Kaidan's eyes widened in shock, his body tensing at the demand. But Roman wasn't finished. The second condition was equally non-negotiable. If there existed no swift route across the endless mountains, then the entire proposal would be rejected outright. Time was the essential factor. Speed would determine whether this alliance had any value at all. Without pausing for Kaidan's response, Roman turned to address his own people. His eyes found Felix, the blonde mage standing among his trusted advisors. Roman's question was direct and practical. How many soldiers could they transport at once using teleportation scrolls? Felix bowed respectfully before delivering his answer with professional precision. Given their current magical technology and resources, 30 people represented the absolute maximum capacity for a single teleportation. Roman absorbed this information and immediately announced his third and final condition. Only 30 warriors, including himself, would depart for the frozen land of Arcadia. The number was final, the decision absolute. Kaidan's mind reeled. Only 30 soldiers against tens of thousands of orcs. The number seemed impossibly small, almost insultingly inadequate. Doubt crept through his thoughts like poison. But then he remembered Queen Isabel's unwavering faith. She had spoken of Roman Dmitry with reverence, describing him as a being who had transcended the limits of ordinary humanity. She believed that even if Roman accomplished nothing more than slaying the orc champion Grar, his intervention would justify any cost. That memory rekindled Kaidan's conviction. He pressed his forehead to the ground, overwhelmed with gratitude. His voice trembled as he thanked Roman repeatedly. Roman cut through the sentiment with characteristic directness, demanding the route to the Luna Kingdom and the operational plan. Still kneeling, Kaidan explained the logistics. His people had already established one-time teleportation coordinates along a route over the endless mountains. Using these magical waypoints, they could reach Arcadia in approximately 1 week. But then Kaidan's expression darkened as he delivered a grave warning. The cold of Arcadia was beyond anything most people could comprehend or survive. He outlined the necessary preparations in detail. First, travelers would need to consume a specialized alchemical compound developed by Luna Kingdom's scholars to help their bodies adapt to the extreme temperatures. After that, a full week of acclimatization training in the snow would be required before anyone could safely attempt the final crossing into Arcadia's heart. Roman rose from his throne, his movement sudden and decisive. He rejected the offer immediately. Dmitry will handle those preparations independently, he stated flatly. Kaidan's composure broke. He protested desperately, explaining that Arcadia's cold was so severe it could freeze even a master swordsman's aura solid. What Roman was suggesting bordered on suicide, but Roman's expression remained completely unfazed, radiating absolute confidence. His response was simple and final. I will ensure Dmitry's forces are prepared on my end. He turned his back and began walking away, signaling the discussion's end. Over his shoulder, he confirmed the timeline. Departure in 1 week as originally planned. Kaidan could only watch him leave, thinking that Roman was being dangerously overconfident. Despite his severe reservations, Kaidan had no choice but to accept the command. He voiced his understanding and offered his unconditional support, pledging to provide any assistance Roman might require. The scene shifted away from Dmitry's stark military halls to a place of breathtaking beauty. The Luna Kingdom was built around an ancient tree of colossal proportions, its architecture flowing organically from the massive trunk and branches. The city gleamed under clear blue skies, a jewel of civilization in the frozen north. This was where the battle for Arcadia's future would soon begin. Inside the royal chambers, a magical communication crystal dimmed as the connection ended. A man in pristine white robes sighed heavily, accepting the inevitable before wishing Caden a safe journey. Beside him, another figure stood in disbelief. Only 30 people. Dalsum, he repeated, unable to process the absurdly small number. The man in white robes was revealed to be High Priest Sebastian, one of Luna Kingdom's highest-ranking officials. He confirmed the number with weary acceptance. Dmitry had made this choice while fully understanding the risks involved. With the decision now final, Sebastian's focus shifted to immediate concerns. He declared that Dmitry's forces would arrive in 2 weeks. Until that moment, Luna Kingdom had one singular mission: hold the fortress at all costs. As Sebastian walked purposefully through the halls, a knight rushed up from behind, calling out urgently. The knight, named Gyro, protested vehemently. With only 30 soldiers, how could they possibly face tens of thousands of orcs? As the renowned swordsman of the snowfield, Gyro believed that if this was the extent of their reinforcements, the Luna Kingdom needed to take matters into their own hands. Clenching his fist in frustration, Gyro declared passionately that they couldn't entrust Luna's entire future to Roman Dmitry alone. They were the only human nation in Arcadia, the guardians of this territory for countless generations. Their pride and history demanded they take action, but Sebastian cut through Gyro's patriotic fervor with brutal honesty. Face reality, Gyro, he stated firmly. Luna Kingdom's strength alone was insufficient to repel tens of thousands of orcs. Gyro refused to accept this assessment. He argued they couldn't simply wait passively for Dmitry's reinforcements. They needed to be proactive, to create an opportunity to eliminate the enemy in a single decisive strike. Fired up with determination, Gyro volunteered himself for the vanguard. His passion proved contagious, and other knights began cheering in agreement, ready to defeat the orcs through their own strength. Watching this display, High Priest Sebastian released a long, weary sigh. He relented with a challenge. What specific method did Gyro propose to use against the orcs? The scene transitioned to the harsh frozen landscape near Luna Kingdom's 6th storage outpost. Gyro stood alone on a snowy peak, wind whipping around his armored form. With grim determination burning in his eyes, he surveyed the desolate terrain and made a solemn vow. This is where you'll be buried, Grar. His plan was ruthlessly clever. The route the orc army was using for their advance happened to overlap with territory claimed by the equally hostile snowmen tribes. Gyro intended to provoke a conflict between these two monstrous races, letting them destroy each other. The snowmen were terrifying creatures, standing over 3 meters tall, covered in thick white fur, possessing monstrous strength capable of overwhelming even powerful orcs in single combat. Gyro understood perfectly that a single small snowman tribe stood no chance against an orc army numbering in the tens of thousands. But he didn't need the snowmen to win. He only needed them to fight. His strategy was brutally simple. Let the two forces grind each other down through attrition. Then, when both sides were weakened and exhausted, the Luna Kingdom would step in to finish the survivors. As Gyro's plan went into motion, the sounds of battle erupted across the snowfield. A massive snowman roared as a pack of orcs swarmed around it, weapons flashing. The brutal conflict was already underway, exactly as planned. The orcs were thrown into confusion by the surprise attack. One orc warrior screamed a frantic warning about enemy snowmen appearing from the blizzard. The snowfield erupted into a full-scale brawl between the two monstrous races. From his concealed position at a safe distance, Gyro watched the chaos he had orchestrated with satisfaction. He calculated that if he triggered an avalanche now, he could deal with both forces simultaneously. But as he clenched his fist ready to give the signal, he suddenly hesitated. Something felt wrong. Through the swirling snow, a new figure appeared on the battlefield. An enormous orc clad in thick furs rode atop a massive black wolf, approaching the chaos with complete calm and confidence. The wolf-riding orc, Grar himself, let out a menacing grin, his red eyes glowing with predatory intelligence. Gyro's confidence shattered instantly. No way, he thought, his face becoming a mask of pure shock. His carefully laid plan was falling apart. One of his hidden men shouted in panic that they'd been discovered. Enemy orcs were surrounding their position. Before Gyro could react, another massive orc wearing a white fur cloak appeared directly before him, looking down with utter disdain. The orc scoffed mockingly. Just as expected, humans relying on petty tricks. Orcs swarmed from every direction, effortlessly scaling the icy cliffs and surrounding Gyro's position with terrifying efficiency. The hunter had become the hunted. Gritting his teeth in frustration, Gyro could only curse his situation. The horrifying truth crashed down upon him as he realized his clever strategy had been turned completely against him. Was I the one who fell into the trap? Oh, he thought in disbelief. The scene flashed back to the day of departure. Inside a Dmitry courtyard under gray skies, Roman's chosen forces stood in perfect formation. 29 soldiers clad in black armor were assembled in disciplined silence. At their head stood their leader, Roman Dmitry himself, the 30th and final member of the expedition force. Watching from the castle walls, a silver-haired man let out a massive yawn, though even he had to admit these warriors all looked exceptionally strong. Kaidan observed from nearby. Completely stunned, he couldn't believe Dmitry possessed warriors of this caliber. He felt an overwhelming pressure emanating from them, comparable to the 3 legendary swordsmen of the Luna Kingdom. The narrative introduced Luna Kingdom's greatest champions. First was Leo, the Royal Knights commander, whose powerful aura was immediately apparent to anyone with combat experience. Second was Gyro, the swordsman of the snowfield, a warrior as fierce and relentless as the blizzards he navigated. Third was Kaidan himself, known as the White Flying Squirrel, whose speed and agility were unmatched throughout the kingdom. Kaidan acknowledged that aside from these 3 legendary figures, he was considered one of the top swordsmen in the entire Luna Kingdom. But that confidence wavered as he studied Dmitry's soldiers more carefully. Their power was palpable, radiating from them like heat from a forge. A troubling question formed in his mind as he assessed them honestly. How many of these warriors could he actually defeat in single combat? Kaidan's doubt evaporated, replaced by a stunning realization that left him breathless. With warriors of this exceptional caliber, he thought with widening eyes, even 30 soldiers might genuinely be enough to turn the tide against tens of thousands of orcs. And leading this elite force was the strongest swordsman among them all, Roman Dmitry himself. He stood before his assembled warriors, his crimson cape flowing in the wind, exuding an aura of absolute power and unshakable confidence that made even legendary fighters feel small in comparison. Overwhelmed by the display of concentrated military might, Kaidan bowed low before Roman Dmitry with genuine respect. "I will guide the way," he offered, his voice filled with reverence. Without needing to be told or compelled, he naturally showed the proper courtesy due to a true superior. The scene snapped back violently to the present, to the brutal reality of the snowy battlefield. Gyro's face was crushed under the heavy boot of an orc warrior, blood foaming from his mouth. His brilliant plan had failed utterly and completely. Grar stood over him victoriously, holding a massive battle axe, while the rest of the orc army surrounded them. Their victory was absolute and crushing. Grar surveyed the battlefield as snow continued to fall, his expression one of supreme satisfaction. It was a devastating defeat for Luna Kingdom's forces. The narrator's voice concluded grimly. It seemed Luna Kingdom's long and proud history might end on this frozen field, crushed under the heel of an orc invasion. The endless mountains lived up to their name, an unforgiving expanse of white death stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Roman Dmitry and his 30 elite warriors tore through the blizzard like shadows given form, their black armor cutting stark contrast against the pristine snow. Leading them was Kaidan, the White Flying Squirrel, whose intimate knowledge of these treacherous peaks was their only advantage against the mountain's merciless terrain. The wind shrieked around them with primal fury, as if the mountain itself objected to their passage. Kaidan glanced backward, and what he saw defied every expectation he'd held. Roman and his soldiers weren't just keeping pace. They moved with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. The technique they employed was unmistakably Arcadian in origin, a specialized movement style that distributed weight across unstable surfaces. But Kaidan had never taught them this. The bewilderment in his mind grew sharper with each passing moment. How had they mastered something so complex without instruction? The question gnawed at him even as they pressed forward through conditions that would have killed ordinary men. The magical communication device in Kaidan's hand suddenly flared to life, its glow cutting through the swirling snow. The voice that emerged was tight with barely controlled panic. "Kaidan, we have a crisis." His heart seized in his chest as he demanded answers. The report that followed painted a nightmare in words. Gyro, one of Luna Kingdom's legendary 3 swordsmen, had launched an ambitious surprise assault on the orc forces. But ambition had turned to catastrophe. The orcs had anticipated his move perfectly. Gyro's entire strike force had been annihilated, and his own fate remained unknown. The voice continued with even grimmer news. Grar himself, The monstrous orc warlord was now personally leading his horde in a direct assault on Luna Fortress. At their current speed, the fortress would fall under siege hours before Roman's reinforcements could possibly arrive. Caden's grip on the communication device tightened until his knuckles went white. Fury and frustration warred within him. He'd explicitly warned Gyro against reckless action. This was supposed to be a straightforward 2-week support mission. Now everything was collapsing. Through gritted teeth, Caden made a promise he wasn't certain he could keep. "Hold the line. Whatever it takes, we're coming." He snapped the device shut and turned to Roman, his expression carved from stone. The situation had escalated beyond worst-case scenarios. Luna Fortress lay a full day's journey ahead under normal circumstances. Caden's voice carried the weight of desperation as he addressed Roman. They would need to push beyond human limits, moving at absolute maximum speed to have any chance of arriving in time. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Caden announced he would guide them along the shortest possible route, a path so dangerous that most travelers avoided it even in favorable conditions. Then, almost as an afterthought born from doubt, he added that anyone who grew exhausted should call out immediately. It was a concession to what he assumed would be the limitations of outsiders in this brutal environment. But as Caden launched forward with everything he had, that red and black figure matched his every movement with seemingly effortless grace. Something impossible caught Caden's attention as he pushed his body to its absolute limits. Roman Dmitry moved across the snow without leaving a single footprint. The snow remained pristine behind him, as though he weighed nothing at all, or perhaps as though the mountain itself refused to acknowledge his presence. This technique didn't exist anywhere in Arcadian martial traditions. It represented a mastery over one's physical form that transcended anything Caden had witnessed in his decades of experience. A spark of hope ignited in Caden's chest, despite the dire circumstances. At this unprecedented pace, they might actually reach Luna Kingdom before nightfall. The impossible distance was shrinking with every heartbeat. But that fragile hope shattered moments later, when the communication device blazed to life once more. The report was stark and terrible. Enemy forces had been sighted approaching Luna Fortress. The voice on the other end announced what everyone feared. The battle for survival had begun. Caden shouted encouragement across the magical connection, promising they would arrive soon, begging his people to hold just a little longer. But as the words left his mouth, the transmission began to falter. Static invaded the channel, a telltale sign of enemy interference. Someone on the orc side possessed magical capabilities strong enough to jam their communications. Through the crackling disruption, a voice broke through one final time. The words hit Caden like physical blows. The fortress was lost. He should abandon Luna and save himself. At least one of them might survive. The transmission died with a final burst of static, leaving Caden staring at the dark crystal in his hand. The silence that followed felt louder than the screaming wind. His homeland, his people, his entire world, all of it was dying while he raced helplessly through the snow. Roman remained silent beside him, but somehow that silence felt more reassuring than any words could have been. Inside a darkened war tent stinking of blood and worse things, a Luna Kingdom soldier knelt before Grar's imposing throne. The man was barely recognizable as human anymore. Torture had stripped away his dignity, his strength, and ultimately his loyalty. Blood matted his hair and clothes, and fresh wounds still wept across his broken body. Under the crushing weight of agony, he'd surrendered every secret he possessed. His voice, raw from screaming, revealed everything about Roman Dmitry and the Dmitry Kingdom's alliance with Luna. The truly damning information spilled out next. The reinforcements numbered only 30 warriors. To the orcs, this seemed laughably inadequate. The soldier explained through broken sobs that this pathetic number was why Lord Gyro had attempted his desperate gambit, hoping to eliminate the threat through Luna's own strength before reinforcements even arrived. Around the tent, the consequences of resistance were displayed with brutal clarity. Other captured soldiers hung from posts, their bodies bearing testament to orcish cruelty. Some were still alive, suspended in positions that ensured maximum suffering. The broken soldier begged for his life, with what remained of his voice. When he realized mercy wasn't coming, his plea changed to something even more desperate, a request for a death without pain. Grar studied the pathetic creature before him with cold calculation. The name Roman Dmitry meant nothing to him. More importantly, 30 reinforcements represented no threat whatsoever to his overwhelming numerical advantage. He turned to his lieutenant, Kolot, and inquired about the status of Luna Fortress. Kolot responded with predatory satisfaction. They were moments away from shattering the divine barrier protecting the fortress. But Grar had grown tired of waiting. The scent of fear wafting from the fortress walls was too intoxicating to ignore any longer. He rose from his throne with terrible finality, announcing his personal involvement. When Grar the Destroyer took the field, battles didn't last long. He emerged from his tent into the swirling snow, and his army erupted with bloodthirsty cheers. The roar was deafening, a sound that promised death and devastation. Thousands of orc warriors surged forward in his wake, a tide of violence that nothing seemed capable of stopping. From the battlements of Luna Fortress, the defenders watched Grar's approach with mounting horror. The orc warlord was a mountain of muscle and malice, and the crimson aura surrounding him was visible even through the blizzard. It pulsed with murderous intent, a physical manifestation of his desire to kill. The soldiers cursed and shouted in frustration and fear. This monster of legend was finally making his move, and they all knew what it meant. Grar drew the massive blade from his back, a weapon that seemed too large for any creature to wield effectively. The red aura intensified around him until it distorted the very air. High Priest Sebastian appeared on the walls, his white robes billowing in the wind. His voice rang out with desperate authority, commanding his priests to pour their divine power into the protective barrier. They responded immediately, their combined faith manifesting as a shimmering golden dome over the fortress. Sebastian knew this barrier represented their only hope. If it fell, every man, woman, and child inside would be slaughtered. The priests chanted in unison, channeling their life force itself into maintaining the shield. Grar approached the barrier with casual confidence. He raised his colossal blade and swung with devastating force. The impact created an explosion of light that momentarily outshone the sun. The shockwave rippled outward, shattering ice formations and sending snow cascading down the mountainside. The golden barrier held, but barely. Spiderweb cracks spread across its surface like frozen lightning. Sebastian felt the divine energy draining from his body at an alarming rate. Sweat poured down his face despite the freezing temperature as he poured more power into the failing barrier. His lips moved in frantic prayer, begging their god for strength to endure just a little longer. But before the cracks could even begin to heal, Grar launched himself into the air with impossible agility for something so massive. His blade came down like judgment itself, and he roared a taunting question. Did they really think they could stop him without Isabel? So the name carried weight in history, but there was no time to dwell on it. Sebastian looked up at the descending blade and understood with perfect clarity that their doom had arrived. The barrier couldn't withstand another blow. The blade struck. The barrier shattered like glass. What followed was beyond description. Luna Fortress, that beautiful testament to human resilience in the frozen north, became a charnel house. The ancient tree at its center burned despite the snow, flames consuming its sacred branches. Orcs poured through the broken gates like a flood of green-skinned death. They killed indiscriminately. Soldiers, priests, civilians, children. No one was spared their savagery. The screams echoed through the mountain passes, a symphony of suffering that would haunt these peaks for generations. The orcs didn't just kill, they feasted. The fortress had become a grotesque banquet hall where the strong devoured the weak in the most literal sense possible. Kolot moved through the carnage with purpose, seeking out survivors for a specific task. He needed bait. He grabbed a terrified soldier and dragged him toward the outer walls. The trap needed to be believable, which meant it needed authentic suffering. Kolot's twisted intelligence had crafted the perfect snare for the approaching reinforcements. Word reached Kolot that figures were approaching through the blizzard. He turned his yellow eyes toward the snowy horizon and spotted them, Roman Dmitry and his warriors. A cruel smile split his face. The plan was falling into place perfectly. He shoved his captive soldier forward and pressed a jagged blade against the man's throat. The instructions were brutally simple. The soldier would call out to the approaching forces, pretending the fortress still stood. He would lure them close to the walls. If he succeeded, Kolot promised to spare both him and his family. It was a transparent lie, but the broken man had nothing left except desperate hope. He agreed with hollow eyes. Hidden throughout the fortress, thousands of orc warriors waited in ambush positions, concealed by the smoke and falling snow. The stage was set for a massacre. On the ramparts, the captive soldier stood alone, or seemed to. Behind him, orcs wearing stolen cloaks hunched their massive frames to appear human from a distance. The illusion was crude but effective in the poor visibility. Through the blizzard, Roman Dmitry's figure emerged with his elite force behind him. The captive soldier's voice cracked as he shouted the scripted words. "Halt! This is Luna territory." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Roman came to an immediate stop, his boot planted firmly in the snow. his cold eyes fixed on the lone figure above with unsettling intensity. The soldier continued his desperate charade, demanding they identify themselves. Behind him, hidden in the smoke and shadows, thousands of orcs waited with weapons ready. The trap was sprung. The only question remaining was whether Roman Dmitry would walk into it, or whether he'd already seen through the deception. Roman stood motionless in the falling snow, his expression unreadable. The fortress burned behind the ramparts, but his focus remained absolute. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of 30 warriors, but the future of an entire kingdom. The blizzard continued to fall, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath its frozen curtain. This was the moment where legends were either born or buried in unmarked graves. The blizzard raged with merciless intensity, transforming the world into a swirling chaos of white and gray. Through the violent snowfall, Roman Dmitry stood like a monument carved from iron, utterly unmoved by the elements that would have broken lesser men. The guard's challenge hung in the frozen air, demanding identification from the strangers who dared approach Luna Fortress in its darkest hour. Roman drew a breath that seemed to pull the very cold into his lungs, then released it as a thunderous proclamation that cut through the howling wind like a blade through silk. His voice carried power that transcended mere volume. "I am Roman Dmitry, Lord of the Dmitry Kingdom." The words resonated with such authority that even the stone walls seemed to tremble. The declaration wasn't a request for entry, it was an announcement of inevitability. Behind those massive gates, countless souls huddled in terror, clinging to hope that had grown dangerously thin. They heard that voice pierce through their despair like the first ray of dawn breaking an endless night. The guard stationed above peered down through the relentless snowfall, his vision obscured by the weather and his growing confusion. His armor creaked as he leaned forward, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he'd been told to expect. Luna had been promised 30 reinforcements from Dmitry, warriors who would turn the tide against the overwhelming orc invasion. But the reality before him seemed like a cruel mockery of those promises. Only 3 figures stood in the snow below, their forms barely visible through the white curtain of the storm. The guard's voice carried a mixture of desperation and suspicion as he called down his question. "The reports said 30 would come. Why do I see only 3? It was a reasonable inquiry that concealed deeper fears. 3 warriors against the thousands of orcs that had shattered their divine barriers and slaughtered their defenders seemed like an insult worse than abandonment. The guard's next question came tinged with desperate hope. Was Lord Caden among them? Perhaps their own champion had returned with these mysterious reinforcements. What the guard couldn't see from his elevated position was the trap that had been meticulously prepared below. Scattered throughout the courtyard and concealed by strategic positioning, orc warriors waited with weapons ready. They had draped themselves in stolen cloaks and positioned themselves to appear as Luna defenders from a distance. Their breathing was controlled despite their savage nature, fingers trembling with anticipation on weapon hilts. The trap had been set with cunning intelligence. Lure the reinforcements close to the walls, then spring the ambush when escape became impossible. Every orc eye fixed on those 3 vulnerable humans standing exposed in the open courtyard. But Roman Dmitry had already seen through the deception. His hand moved with deliberate purpose to the sword at his waist. The sound of steel sliding free from its scabbard rang out clear, despite the howling wind, a sound that promised violence and judgment in equal measure. He stood before Luna's gates not as a supplicant seeking entry, but as a conqueror claiming what was already his by right. His next words would shatter whatever remained of the old order. Roman's voice cut through the storm with absolute finality. Luna Kingdom has become a vassal state of Dmitry. It wasn't a proposal or a negotiation, it was a statement of accomplished fact. To prove his authority, he raised his hand high, displaying the medallion that Caden had entrusted to him. The emblem caught what little light penetrated the gray storm clouds, gleaming with unmistakable legitimacy. This was no theft or forgery. This was the genuine article, marking him as Luna's rightful superior. His gaze swept upward to the guards manning the walls, his eyes burning with intensity that transcended the physical storm. From this moment forward, the people of Luna answer to me alone. The declaration carried implications that reached far beyond mere military alliance. Sovereignty itself was being transferred in the midst of a war zone, with enemy forces literally hidden among them. Then his tone shifted, taking on a quality that bordered on sacred oath. "Swear your loyalty to me, and I will not abandon you. I will fight until my last breath to ensure every single one of you survives this nightmare." Inside the fortress, where captive civilians had been bound and corralled by their orc captors, those words penetrated through stone and snow alike. Mothers who had lost all hope felt something stir in their hearts, something they'd thought dead. Old men who had resigned themselves to becoming orc meals lifted their faces from the ground, tears mixing with the grime on their weathered cheeks. Children stopped their quiet sobbing and listened to that voice promising salvation. Roman's conviction wasn't just audible, it was tangible, a force that pushed back against the despair that had consumed them. But the orcs had been listening too. Kolat, the cunning lieutenant commanding the ambush force, felt alarm bells ringing in his mind. Something in Roman's bearing, in the purple flicker beginning to manifest in the human's eyes, warned him that the trap was about to turn catastrophic. His voice erupted in a guttural command that shook the very air. Attack! I'd kill them now. But the order came a heartbeat too late. Roman moved faster than thought itself. Before Kolat's words could fully register with his troops, the human lord was already channeling power that defied natural law. His eyes blazed with brilliant purple light, the unmistakable signature of the heavenly demon sword art. The air itself seemed to warp and scream as concentrated energy gathered around his blade. For one impossible moment, the snowfall itself seemed to freeze in place, suspended by the sheer magnitude of power being unleashed. The first form tore through reality with apocalyptic force. Roman's blade swept toward the massive fortress gates in an arc that carried the weight of divine judgment. The reinforced iron that had withstood countless sieges simply ceased to exist. The stone walls flanking the entrance, structures that had been built to last centuries, exploded into dust and fragments. The shockwave alone sent orcs tumbling through the air like children's toys. In a single devastating instant, Roman had erased the boundary between outside and inside, transforming the fortress's primary defensive position into a gaping wound. Even as debris was still falling from his catastrophic attack, Roman's voice rang out with tactical precision. Chris, Kevin. His trusted warriors immediately locked onto his words despite the chaos erupting around them. Your mission is to locate and extract the prisoners. Do not expect safety. We are outnumbered 1,000 to 3. His honesty was brutal but necessary. There was no room for illusions in this slaughterhouse. Your only objective is to kill everything standing between you and those captives. Show no mercy because you will receive none. Both men responded with immediate acknowledgement, their own combat auras flaring to life like twin stars igniting in the darkness. Chris's energy manifested as a brilliant gold that seemed to burn away the very shadows. Kevin's aura pulsed with deep crimson intensity. Without hesitation or fear, they charged forward into the heart of enemy territory where thousands of orcs waited. Their faces showed no doubt, only the grim determination of warriors who had absolute faith in their commander's plan. The scene shifted backward through time, pulling away from the violence to a quieter moment heavy with grief. After receiving confirmation that Luna Fortress had fallen to the orcish invasion, Caden had stood before Roman with the expression of a man attending his own funeral. The characteristic light in his eyes, the fire that had defined him as one of Luna's legendary champions, had been extinguished completely. Only a hollow emptiness remained where pride and purpose once dwelled. His voice was steady but lifeless as he delivered his farewell. The fortress has fallen. Luna is lost. Each word seemed to cost him physically, as though speaking them carved pieces from his soul. He looked at Roman with gratitude mixed with profound sorrow. I can no longer ask you to remain here. Thank you for coming all this way from your homeland. Your willingness to help will not be forgotten, even if there's no Luna Kingdom left to remember it. Caden bowed deeply, his forehead nearly touching his knees in a gesture of absolute respect and finality. I apologize that we cannot repay your kindness. This was our fight, not yours. His eyes had gone dead, reflecting the corpse of hope. In his mind, asking warriors from another nation to die for Luna's mistakes was unconscionable. The only honorable path remaining was to part ways here, allowing Roman to return home safely while Caden marched alone to join his fallen kingdom in death. But Roman's expression remained as unmoved as mountain stone. No pity softened his features. No fear flickered in his gaze. He looked at Caden with the cold clarity of someone who saw the absolute truth of a situation. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of immutable law. From the moment Dmitry formed an alliance with Luna, your kingdom became our vassal state. The fate of that vassal is no longer yours to decide. It belongs to Dmitry. You no longer possess the authority to surrender or retreat. The logic was ruthlessly absolute. By accepting Dmitry's protection and resources, Luna had surrendered its right to give up. Roman would not permit his investment to simply collapse because its people had lost hope. His expression hardened further as he issued his command. Tell me everything about the fortress. Floor plans, guard positions, enemy numbers, structural weaknesses, hidden passages, every detail you possess. Now. Caden's dead eyes flickered with something resembling shock. That small spark of renewed life was enough to break through his despair. His voice gained strength as he began describing his homeland in minute detail, providing information that would have been considered treasonous under any other circumstances. But Luna was already fallen. What did secrets matter to the dead? Together they crafted a strategy that bordered on suicidal. A pincer operation utilizing Luna's secret passages would split their already minimal forces into two groups facing overwhelming odds. The main element, 27 of Dmitry's elite soldiers led by Caden himself, would navigate the treacherous mountain paths to reach a hidden cave entrance. This group would infiltrate deep into the fortress's interior, using passages known only to Luna's highest-ranking defenders. Meanwhile, Roman would lead Chris and Kevin in a frontal assault on the main gate. 3 men would draw the attention of thousands, becoming bait so obvious that no Orc commander could resist committing forces to crush them. The plan required perfect timing, absolute trust, and a level of individual combat capability that bordered on mythical. Caden led the main infiltration force through passages carved into the mountain itself centuries ago. Their torches cast dancing shadows against damp stone walls that dripped with melted snow. The narrow tunnel forced them into single file, their breathing and equipment creating a rhythmic echo that threatened to give away their position. Anxiety gnawed at Caden despite his best efforts to project confidence. He glanced back at the Dmitry soldiers following in disciplined silence and asked the question that had been eating at him. "Do you truly believe this plan can succeed?" The response came without hesitation from the soldier directly behind him. "Of course it will succeed." The answer was delivered with such complete certainty, such utter absence of doubt, that it silenced Caden's fears more effectively than any reassurance could have. He studied these men more carefully, seeing past their armor to the absolute conviction in their eyes. They didn't hope their commander's plan would work. They knew it would. That level of unwavering faith spoke to something profound about Roman Dmitry's leadership. Caden's thoughts turned philosophical as they pressed deeper into the mountain. Luna needed exactly this kind of leader. Someone who inspired such absolute loyalty that doubt became impossible. Perhaps surrendering sovereignty to Dmitry wasn't the tragedy he'd initially believed. If this was the caliber of warriors Dmitry's system produced, then Luna would be safer as a vassal than it had ever been as an independent kingdom desperately clinging to fading glory. The tunnel suddenly widened, and Caden's practiced eye caught movement ahead. 2 Orc scouts wandered through the cave system, their ugly features twisted in confusion as they processed the unexpected sight of intruders. Before Caden could even reach for his weapon or shout a warning, 2 Dmitry soldiers exploded into motion with predatory grace. The Orcs didn't stand a chance. Before they could bellow an alarm or raise their weapons, blades found their throats with surgical precision. The kills were silent, efficient, and absolutely merciless. Both bodies crumpled to the cave floor without ceremony. Caden stood frozen in shock. He'd fought Orcs his entire adult life and knew intimately how dangerous they were. Their thick hides could turn aside poorly aimed strikes. Their berserker strength could shatter shields and bones alike. Yet these Dmitry soldiers had dispatched them as easily as cutting wheat. The speed, the accuracy, the complete absence of wasted motion. It spoke to training that transcended anything Luna's military academies could produce. As they pressed forward through the tunnels, systematically eliminating every Orc patrol they encountered, Caden's understanding underwent a fundamental transformation. When he'd first heard that Dmitry was sending only 30 reinforcements, he'd felt insulted. 30 men against thousands seemed like a joke, a token gesture that would accomplish nothing but add 30 more corpses to the pile. But now, watching these warriors move through the darkness like shadows given lethal purpose, he understood the terrible truth. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Each one of them was worth 100 normal warriors. The infiltration group moved with mechanical efficiency, executing Orcs before the creatures could raise an alarm. Their blades found vital points with unerring accuracy even in the dim torchlight. Caden felt something he hadn't experienced in days, genuine hope. Not the desperate fantasy of a drowning man, but the solid confidence born from witnessing undeniable capability. He whispered a prayer to gods he'd nearly lost faith in, thanking them for sending Roman Dmitry when Luna needed salvation most desperately. Back at the shattered main gate, the situation had evolved into pure chaos. Kolot had screamed orders for his troops to overwhelm the 3 humans through sheer numbers. The mathematics seemed undeniable. Thousands against 3 could only end one way. The Orcish horde surged forward like a tsunami of green flesh and rusted iron, their collective roar shaking the very foundations of the mountain. The ground trembled under the weight of so many charging bodies converging on a single point. But Roman Dmitry stood immovable, a pillar of defiance against the incoming tide. His blade swept in a devastating horizontal arc, and reality itself seemed to buckle under the force. A shockwave of pure kinetic energy erupted outward, sending dozens of orcs tumbling through the air like leaves caught in a hurricane. The purple aura surrounding Roman intensified until he appeared to be wreathed in dark flames that consumed everything they touched. He moved through the orcish ranks like death incarnate, each strike finding a throat, each movement ending a life. The orcs fought with berserk abandon, driven by bloodlust and their commander's orders. They trampled over their own fallen comrades in their desperation to reach the human who was carving through their ranks. An orc champion swung a massive battle axe toward Roman's head with enough force to split a boulder. Roman didn't bother blocking or parrying. He simply wasn't there when the weapon arrived, his body flowing around the attack like water around stone. Then he used the orc's own weapon as a stepping stone, launching himself upward to deliver a killing strike before his enemy even understood what had happened. Roman channeled even greater power into his blade, his purple aura intensifying to blinding brilliance. The heavenly demon sword art's second form manifested with apocalyptic force. For one heartbeat, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the destruction about to be unleashed. Then, the world exploded. A massive detonation of concentrated energy tore through the earth itself, creating a crater that swallowed dozens of orcs instantly. Boulders the size of houses were thrown hundreds of feet into the air along with broken bodies. The snow vaporized in a radius around the blast, exposing scorched earth beneath. The surviving orcs finally showed genuine fear. The berserker rage that had driven them forward evaporated, replaced by primal terror. They had conquered kingdoms and devoured armies, but they had never faced anything like this. Their voices cracked as they screamed the only word that could describe what they were witnessing. Monster. But before they could flee or even finish their panicked cries, Chris and Kevin were among them, their own combat prowess creating a slaughter that complemented Roman's destruction perfectly. Orcs stationed on the fortress wall suddenly realized they had enemies in both directions. They turned to find Dmitry's soldiers emerging from the fortress's interior. Caden's infiltration force had successfully reached their objective. The soldiers moved with cold precision, cutting through orcs who had thought themselves safe behind the walls. The pincer operation had worked exactly as planned. The enemy was now caught between two forces of overwhelming individual capability. Kolat stood in the middle of the chaos, his tactical mind finally grasping the full horror of their situation. They had underestimated Dmitry catastrophically. What they'd assumed was a weak human kingdom was actually something far more dangerous. His 10,000 warriors were being systematically annihilated by 30. The humiliation transcended military defeat. It was an existential crisis that shattered everything the orcs believed about their own superiority. Desperation drove Kolat to his final gambit. He screamed for the shaman, and from the center of the orcish formation, a withered creature draped in bones and fetishes hobbled forward. The shaman's voice rose in a high-pitched rhythmic chant that seemed to rot the very air it touched. Dark energy pulsed outward in waves, infecting every orc it touched with corrupting power. Their eyes turned blood red, glowing with unnatural light. Their consciousness fled, replaced by magical compulsion that stripped away everything except the drive to kill. The transformed orcs became something worse than soldiers. They became weapons with no off switch. Pain meant nothing to them. An orc missing an arm continued fighting with the other, its face showing no recognition of the injury. Another creature with its guts spilling onto the snow simply held them in with one hand while swinging its weapon with the other. They had transcended fear and pain, becoming extensions of the shaman's dark will. One of these magically enhanced orcs, despite having sustained mortal wounds, rose from where it had fallen. Its eyes burned with that terrible red glow as it spotted Kevin engaged in combat with 3 other enemies. The creature grabbed its massive axe and hurled it with remaining strength. The weapon spun through the air in a deadly arc, aimed directly at Kevin's unprotected back. The whistling sound was barely audible over the battle's chaos, and Kevin was completely focused on the immediate threats before him. The axe flew toward his skull with lethal accuracy, promising death from an unexpected angle.
The cold wind screamed across the ruined battlefield, threading through shattered stone and broken bodies as if the land itself were mourning. Snow fell in relentless sheets, but no amount of white could hide the dark smear of blood soaking into the ground around Luna Fortress. The war had reached its peak, a symphony of roars, steel and death echoing between the jagged peaks. In the middle of that chaos, time seemed to fracture. An orc whose mind had been broken by dark magic stood behind Kevin, its eyes glowing a dull, murderous red. The creature's massive axe spun in its grip as it raised the weapon high, then hurled it like a guillotine at Kevin's unprotected back. For the young warrior, the world slowed to a crawl. He felt the weight of the incoming blow like a shadow settling over his spine, heavier and colder than the winter air. His exhausted muscles screamed, but refused to obey. He tried to twist, to duck, to raise his sword, anything, but his body felt submerged in tar. The blade cut through the air toward him. Before it reached its mark, another figure burst into that frozen moment. Steel crashed against steel with a shriek that tore through the battlefield. Sparks exploded in the swirling snow as Chris slid between Kevin and the incoming axe at impossible speed, his sword intercepting the killing blow. The impact rattled his arms and sent a spray of orange light across the grey sky, but the lethal trajectory was shattered. Boots buried in blood-stained snow, Chris held his ground like a wall of iron. He didn't even turn his head. "Don't let your guard down." His voice was calm, clipped. A simple reprimand in the middle of hell. For a heartbeat, only the orc's harsh breathing filled the space between them. Kevin stared at Chris's back, his life saved by the man he'd sworn to compete with. What should have been gratitude twisted into something darker. Shame burned through his chest, hotter than any wound. The realization that he would have died if not for Chris sliced deeper than any blade. That shame ignited. Red aura exploded around Kevin's body, flaring into a violent storm that turned falling snow into steam before it could reach his skin. Rage, humiliation, and raw frustration swirled into a crimson halo. Without answering, without acknowledging the rescue, he launched himself forward. The world blurred as he lunged at the orc, his movement fueled not by discipline, but by the desperate need to prove he was not a burden. Kevin's sword carved across the orc's chest with brutal force. The creature howled, a guttural roar ripped from its lungs as its thick hide split open. Blood poured over its torso, but Kevin was far from finished. He was no longer thinking. He was a vessel for the rage that consumed him. He leapt into the air, armor and all, his eyes blazing with a divine, almost judgmental light. At the peak of his jump, he brought his sword down with both hands, channeling every ounce of rage into the strike. The blade split the monster before it could even fall to its knees. Kevin landed hard in the snow, breath ragged, aura slowly dimming as the surge of power faded. His hands trembled from the intensity of the release. He turned toward Chris, pride and defensiveness warring across his face. "Even if you hadn't helped," he said, forcing the lie through clenched teeth. "I could have avoided that attack." They both knew it wasn't true. Kevin had felt death closing in. If Chris hadn't intervened, he would already be lying in the snow with a broken spine. But his voice was steady, stubbornly clinging to the illusion of control. Chris didn't argue. He watched the younger warrior with eyes that held neither mockery nor pity, only understanding. A faint smile tugged at his lips, the expression of a veteran who recognized the fire of a rival struggling to grow. "In that case," Chris replied lightly, "let's make it interesting. How about a bet and whoever kills more orcs wins?" Oh, it wasn't just competition. It was guidance. Instead of scolding Kevin for his recklessness, Chris redirected his frustration toward the one thing that mattered, annihilating the enemy. Kevin clicked his tongue, jaw tight. "You don't need to tell me twice." Their unspoken agreement was sealed not with words, but with the blood already soaking the snow. While their rivalry flared, the true reaper of the battlefield continued his work. Roman Dmitry moved among the orcs like a shadow carved from the storm itself. There was no wasted motion, no shouting, no theatrics. Where others stomped and slipped on frozen ground, Roman seemed to glide, his steps so light that the snow barely recorded his passing. His sword rose and fell with mechanical simplicity, one motion, one corpse. Orcs who towered over ordinary men were reduced to stumbling fools in front of him, their power meaningless against his perfect form. Each strike was precise enough to be called surgical. He didn't hack or thrash. He cut. Throats, hearts, joints. Every blow landed exactly where it needed to be. The battlefield around him was a carving, and Roman was the sculptor, calmly removing everything that did not belong. Seeing their lord's relentless advance, Kevin and Chris fell silent. Whatever petty emotions churned inside them faded away as they watched the standard they aspired to reach. Compared to that man, their rivalry was small. High above, on the battered fortress walls, the Orc commander watched the tide shift. Krat, general of the Orc forces, surveyed the carnage with growing horror. His yellow eyes locked again and again on Roman's figure, that relentless violet light cutting his army apart. Logic insisted the human should have long since exhausted his strength. No warrior, human or otherwise, could maintain that level of mana and physical output for so long. Yet Roman kept moving, kept killing, his pace unbroken. Every time the Orcs threw another wave at him, the result was the same. Bodies fell, and Roman stepped forward through the gap. The distance between Roman and the wall grew smaller with terrifying inevitability. Fear coiled in Krat's gut, cold and suffocating. The limit he'd been waiting for, the moment Roman would slow, stagger or collapse, refused to appear. Desperation gnawed at his sanity. He snarled at the shaman at his side. Use a stronger spell. The shaman began to chant, weaving a new ritual, but it was already too late. From below, a focused blast of mana and compressed air roared upward. Krat barely managed to throw himself aside as the invisible strike tore past, close enough that he felt it brush his cheek. The castle wall behind him didn't just crack, it disintegrated in a straight line, stone shredding like brittle parchment. Dust billowed. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Roman and Krat locked eyes across the distance, the human lord standing amidst a mountain of corpses, the Orc commander poised atop the wall. In that single exchange of glances, whatever remained of Krat's courage shattered. He saw no fatigue in Roman's gaze, no hesitation, only cold intent, pride shriveled, replaced by animal survival instinct. Krat turned and fled. He ran along the ramparts, boots pounding against stone, leaving his army to die behind him. To him, the fortress was already gone. The only thing left to save was his own life. While chaos devoured the walls, a different struggle unfolded in the fortress's dark veins. 27 of Dmitry's elite soldiers, who had entered through the secret tunnel, had successfully forced their way into the heart of the stronghold. Moving like phantoms in the damp, torch-lit corridors, they cut down guards and opened cells with unyielding efficiency. Chains broke, locks shattered, and one by one the prisoners realized what was happening. They were being saved. Tears flowed freely as families clung to each other, the crushing weight of hopelessness lifting at last. Cries of gratitude filled the air, people called Caden's name, blessing Dmitry and its mysterious lord. To them, these 27 warriors were not mere soldiers. They were avenging spirits, sent to drag them back from the edge of hell. But their leader did not allow emotion to cloud his judgment. The Dmitry captain in charge of the group kept his voice level as he issued orders. First squad, keep searching. There may be more prisoners in the lower cells. We don't leave anyone behind. The first group moved without hesitation, peeling away into deeper darkness. Second squad, gather everyone we've freed. We move to the main gate. Protect them at all costs. Caden stood among the rescued crowd, watching the Dmitry soldiers with something close to awe. Their discipline did not waver, even as sobbing civilians clutched at them. With only 30 men, Roman had turned a hopeless massacre into a winnable war. Caden realized he was witnessing something that future generations would call legend. An orc lunged from the shadows. Hiding behind a stack of crates, one of the surviving beasts hurled itself at Caden with a desperate roar, dagger aimed for his back. This time, Caden did not freeze. The man who had once been eaten alive by despair had been reforged on this battlefield. His sword flashed. In a single motion, Caden twisted, drew, and swung. The orc's head flew from its shoulders, thudding onto the stone a moment before the body collapsed. The attack ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving only silence and the copper scent of fresh blood. He didn't waste the moment. "Everyone, move," Caden shouted, his voice firm and commanding. "Follow Dmitry's soldiers." The civilians obeyed without question, fear giving way to desperate trust. The corridors filled with the sound of hurried footsteps as the rescued made their way toward the light. Outside, the heart of the battlefield transformed into a vision from a nightmare. Before the ruined main gate, corpses had piled so high they formed a grotesque barrier. Orc bodies and human remains lay tangled in a mound that reached almost to the splintered walls. The snow beneath had turned from white to a thick crimson slush, every step squelched with the sound of soaked leather and crushed flesh. It was less a field of battle and more a lake of blood. Near that grisly wall, Chris and Kevin leaned against the fortress stones, chests heaving with exhaustion. Their armor bore the history of the battle, dents, scratches, and streaks of dried gore. Their swords were nicked and stained, hanging loosely in their tired grips. Chris glanced sideways at Kevin, studying the younger warrior's battered form. Despite himself, he felt a grudging respect settle in his chest. The kid had pushed far beyond what many seasoned soldiers could endure. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought crossed his mind clearly. Not bad. Kevin stared at the ground, fingers twitching around his hilt. Sweat and melted snow dripped from his hair, mixing with the blood on his face. He knew he'd fought well, better than he ever had, but he also knew he'd still fallen short of Chris. The frustration was suffocating. Every ragged breath carried the bitter taste of inadequacy. Yet there was one thing they could agree on. As they lifted their eyes and looked past the sea of bodies to where Roman still stood, sword in hand, their rivalry shrank into insignificance. Roman was still moving, still cutting down any orc foolish enough to remain standing. While they leaned on the wall, he alone stood upright, a solitary pillar of power amid the carnage. Compared to their lord, both Chris and Kevin were still standing at the bottom of a mountain they hadn't even begun to climb. Their moment of reflection ended when a soldier hurried over to Roman, face tight. "Lord Dmitry, there is a problem." Roman turned his head slightly, attention shifting. His posture, his breathing, nothing about him showed the fatigue that weighed on his men. "Speak." "The Orc commander," the soldier reported. "Krat. He has barricaded himself inside a building, and he's taken prisoners as hostages." Roman's eyes narrowed as the memory resurfaced. The coward who'd fled from the wall. "Take me to him." They arrived at a structure near the inner courtyard, its entrance blocked by nervous guards and terrified survivors. In front of the sealed door stood Krat, his back pressed against the wood, one thick arm wrapped around a trembling girl. In his other hand, he clutched a crude, magical detonator, faint light pulsing at its core. His voice cracked with both fear and bluster. "If you don't accept my terms, I'll blow this place apart. The bomb will kill every prisoner inside." He lifted the device higher for all to see, digging his claws into the girl's shoulders as she whimpered. "You have 10 minutes. Guarantee my safe escape, or they all die." In his mind, Krat still believed he held the advantage. Humans, he thought, were weak. Soft creatures shackled by their attachment to each other. They couldn't bear the thought of sacrificing innocent lives. That sentimentality would be his shield. Roman stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively as he moved, his steps quiet, unhurried. He stopped a short distance away, eyes cool as they settled on the Orc commander. "So," Roman said, voice devoid of any visible emotion, "you wish to negotiate with me." For a flicker of a moment, Krat felt hope, but then he saw it. The faint curve at the corner of Roman's mouth, not fear, not urgency, curiosity. Roman tilted his head slightly. "Do you know why I didn't kill you earlier?" The question hit Krat like a slap. This wasn't how negotiations were supposed to begin. "What nonsense are you babbling?" he snarled, tightening his grip on the hostage. The glow of the detonator pulsed faster as his thumb hovered over the trigger. "I'll kill them. I swear I will," Roman continued, as if he hadn't heard the threat. His gaze didn't waver. "You abandoned your own warriors and ran. You discarded your men to save yourself. That is the kind of commander you are, without honor, without worth." His voice carried clearly to every ear in the courtyard, soldiers and civilians alike. "You are not feared. You are despised." Rage twisted Krat's features. "You think your foolish words matter. I keep talking and I'll—" His thumb began to press the trigger. In the next instant, the detonator clattered to the ground. Krat blinked, stunned. His hand felt suddenly light. He looked down and saw blood. His wrist ended in a ragged stump. His severed hand, still loosely clutching the detonator, lay on the stone at Roman's feet. Roman stood where he had been, sword drawn, blade wet with fresh blood. "I told you," he said coldly. "You have no value whatsoever." No one had seen him move. Not the prisoners, not the soldiers, not even the orc whose hand had been removed. One moment Krat had leverage, the next he had nothing but pain and terror. Roman's lips curved into a smile colder than the snow around them. "But now, you've gained a little worth." He grabbed what remained of Krat and dragged him across the ground like a discarded sack. The orc's once imposing frame scraped across stone, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. Roman hauled him into the open square where the rescued civilians and exhausted soldiers had gathered. There, he threw Krat down before them. "This," Roman announced, his voice ringing clear, "is the last surviving orc commander. I intend to execute him." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many stepped back instinctively at the sight of the monster who had orchestrated their suffering. But Roman did not raise his sword. Instead, he held the hilt out, not toward the orc, but toward the people. "His life belongs to you," he said. "You, who lived through his cruelty. You, who lost everything under his command. Take this blade. His blood is yours to spill." Fear gripped the civilians. The trauma of captivity still clung to them like chains. Even now, standing in the open, many felt like prisoners. Krat tried to weaponize that fear one last time, cackling through the pain. He whispered threats, promised revenge, tried to turn their memories against them. They flinched. They hesitated. Then a small hand rose. A boy stepped forward from the crowd, thin, clothes torn, eyes sunken from hunger and sleepless nights. He looked barely strong enough to lift a sword, but his voice didn't waver when he spoke. "I'll do it." Roman watched him silently as the boy approached and gripped the offered hilt. The sword rasped out of its scabbard with a lonely, echoing sound. Tears welled up in the boy's eyes, blurring his vision, but he didn't stop walking. He stood over Krat's broken body. "My name is Smith," he said softly, voice shaking. "My friend, he was kind. He couldn't even kill an ant." His fingers tightened around the sword. You skinned him, and you ate him, in front of me." The words tore through the crowd, faces twisted with horror, grief and fury. Smith's shoulders shook as sobs tried to break his voice, but he pushed the blade forward. "Why? Oh," he choked out. "Why did you do that?" He didn't wait for an answer that would never come. Smith's sword plunged into Krat's flesh, once, twice, again and again, each thrust fueled not by skill, but by raw, annihilating grief. He stabbed wildly, screaming, sobbing, demanding answers that the dying orc could no longer provide. Every movement was a desperate attempt to carve his pain out of reality. Watching him, something in the crowd snapped. A mother stepped forward, her eyes hollow, her hands shaking, as she remembered the child she'd never see again. A man whose home had burned to the ground pushed through, expression twisted with rage. A sister who had lost her brother grabbed whatever weapon she could and joined them. They surged as one. What followed was no clean execution. It was a storm of vengeance. Blades, fists, and boots fell upon Krat's body until it ceased to resemble a living creature at all. The people who had been victims became executioners, pouring years of terror and helplessness into every strike. They tore the last orc commander apart until nothing recognizable remained. Caden watched, stomach churning. He'd seen battlefields drenched in blood, had walked among severed limbs and shattered armor. But this was different. This was not soldiers killing enemies. This was a people tearing apart the last piece of their nightmare with their bare hands. He stepped toward Roman, unable to stand still any longer. "Isn't this enough?" So he asked quietly. He's already dead. The crowd continued to strike what was left of Krat, their faces contorted by a mixture of fury and relief. Smith's small body shook as he kept swinging, long after there was nothing left to cut. Caden swallowed hard. "I don't care about the orc," he admitted. "But if this continues, that boy, he'll lose himself. He'll fall too far. How is he supposed to live with this?" Roman turned his gaze on Caden, eyes ancient and unreadable. "Does this sight seem cruel to you?" he asked. Caden hesitated. "It's not cruelty toward the orc I worry about," he said. "It's what this will do to them, to Smith, to their hearts." Roman looked away from the ravaged corpse and out over the ruined fortress, the collapsed walls, the burned buildings, the stained snow. His cloak stirred in the cold wind as he spoke, voice low but absolute. "You're mistaken." He spoke like someone who had seen civilizations rise in splendor and die in fire. "The peaceful Arcadia you remember no longer exists. This world has become one of steel and blood. People are carrying wounds that will never heal. The only way forward is to trample the enemies who gave them those scars." Caden listened, jaw tight. "For Luna to move on," Roman continued, "they cannot simply forget. They must crush what tormented them. Otherwise their fear will rule them for the rest of their lives. This is war, and we are not done." He looked to the horizon beyond the fortress walls, where other battles surely raged unseen. "What happened here is happening elsewhere," Roman said. "In distant lands, the strong are devouring the weak. If you truly want peace, then you cannot show mercy to those who would see you broken. Mercy for monsters is cruelty toward the people you're trying to protect." His words echoed off the battered stone, sinking into every heart that heard them. "That," Roman concluded, "is the path of Dmitry. If you choose to stand with us, it is the path you must walk from now on."
Caden stood in the bitter northern wind, listening to its hollow scream as it rolled over the frozen peaks like a requiem for a world that no longer existed. The cold bit into his skin, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing on his chest as Roman's words replayed in his mind. He had resisted them at first, clinging to the memory of a gentler Arcadia, a land of laughter, shared warmth, and peace so natural that no one ever questioned it. Now those days felt like a fragile dream crushed beneath the iron-shod boots of invading monsters. To fight the beasts that had shattered their world, they too had to become something inhuman. That was the truth that bruised his soft nature more than any wound. He had always been a man of empathy and calm reason, but the world no longer had space for that kind of softness. Beyond the walls, Arcadia lay under its familiar blanket of snow, a pristine white shroud that covered both old mistakes and fading hopes. It was beautiful, but in a cold, uncaring way. The city gate, once torn apart in battle, now stood rebuilt, fresh timber, cold iron, and raw repairs marking it like a scar that had closed but would never fully heal. The very next day, within those walls, a senior staff meeting was called. The room was thick with the scent of damp clothes, ink, and tension. Caden stood at the head of a battered table, explaining the situation with a calm voice that barely concealed his exhaustion. Pointing to the map spread before them, he laid out the facts. After capturing Luna Fortress, Graxar had marched east toward Elven lands, leaving Krat and 10,000 orcs behind. If the elves fell as well, there would be nothing left to stop the orcish tide. And even if they wanted to counterattack now that Roman had reclaimed Luna, the storm outside was turning the world into a death trap. The blizzard was their greatest enemy. Moving an army through that kind of storm would be nearly impossible. Horses would sink into the drifts, men would freeze before they ever saw the enemy, and the orcs, who thrived in snowfields like predators born of ice, would tear them apart. Caden admitted bluntly that if they fought the orcs in those conditions, they would lose. Across from him, Roman sat with arms folded, as solid and unshakable as the mountains themselves. His eyes didn't show doubt or fear, only calculation. The war, he said, was now a war against time. Every moment they spent hesitating was another moment Graxar used to secure his dominance. Right now, Graxar still believed Luna had fallen. That ignorance was their last advantage, and if they didn't seize it, the chance would be gone forever. Caden argued that there was simply no way to move through that storm, gesturing to the window where whiteout conditions swallowed everything beyond the glass. Roman met his gaze directly and told him to gather every soldier Luna could muster. There was something in his eyes, an authority that didn't ask for agreement, it demanded obedience. He would show them a way to survive, he said, a path Luna had never learned to walk. The scene shifted from the smoky, cramped chamber to the open training grounds inside the fortress. The wind whipped cloaks and banners as Luna's warriors stood in formation, faces tired and hardened by loss. Roman stood before them, his silhouette stark against the grey sky. He began by telling them something they did not want to hear. He acknowledged their efforts to adapt to Arcadia's brutal environment, but said that they lacked desperation. Silence fell, heavy and sharp. The words cut deep. These men had bled in the snow, watched their homes burn, and buried their dead. To hear that it still wasn't enough felt like an insult. Caden couldn't hold back and asked if Roman was claiming they hadn't truly tried. It was anger born of wounded pride and exhausted hearts. But Roman's face remained completely unreadable as he answered yes. Inwardly, Roman compared Luna to another place he knew, the North Sea Ice Palace from his past life. He thought of what separated the two. The answer to him was simple. In Luna, safety had been guaranteed by the power of the World Tree and Queen Isabella. Beneath that divine shelter, the people had forgotten how to stand on their own. Perhaps in the beginning, Luna had fought hard to survive the cold. But once Isabella was born and her blessings spread warmth and protection, they had grown complacent. They traded vigilance for comfort, discipline for dependence. When she disappeared, the entire kingdom crumbled almost overnight. He told them that plainly. Luna, he said, had placed its entire weight on a single pillar. When that pillar vanished, the structure collapsed. A country that lost its ability to defend itself the moment one person went missing could not be called normal. The soldiers shifted uneasily because beneath the sting of his criticism there was truth they couldn't deny. Then Roman made a declaration. Now that Luna had been placed under Dmitry's command, he would make them self-reliant. He would not simply protect them, he would break and rebuild them. He introduced a new name to them, Seelin's martial arts. It was more than a fighting technique, it was a way of existing in the snow. He explained that it wasn't just about moving across the frozen land. It was about erasing one's presence entirely, leaving no footprints, no breath, no sound. With it, they could become part of the winter itself, unseen, unfelt, yet deadly. More than that, he would teach them how to track enemies even in the heart of a blizzard, where eyes were useless and sight vanished into white. It was a discipline that surpassed Luna's old ways in every respect. The training that followed was merciless. Days blurred into one another, filled with harsh drills and relentless conditioning. Soldiers who had once been stiff and clumsy in deep snow learned to glide over it. They learned to steady their breathing, to quiet their hearts, to feel the slightest tremor beneath their boots and the faintest shift in the wind. One day, as they watched Roman move through waist-deep snow as easily as if he walked on stone, one of the lunar warriors whispered to Caden, asking if Roman was some kind of angel sent by the gods. Others murmured in agreement. To them, there was no other explanation for what they were seeing. Caden looked at Roman and shook his head. No, he answered. Roman was not an angel. He remembered their first meeting. The overwhelming presence, the calm savagery in combat, the unbreakable will. For a brief moment in the past, even Caden had wanted to believe Roman was a divine savior. But the longer he followed him, the clearer it became. Angels brought mercy and comfort. Roman Dmitry brought something else entirely. He was the very embodiment of a warrior's spirit, the will to endure, to dominate, to bend the world through sheer strength of resolve. In Caden's eyes, Roman had already stepped into the realm of transcendence, beyond normal human limits. He told the others that if they followed this man, they might one day reach toward that same distant height. Preparations finished quickly. There was no room left for doubt or delay. 2 days later, under a bruised purple sky, the heavy gates of Lunar Fortress opened once more. Roman and the newly trained lunar warriors stepped out into the blizzard. This time, they did not stumble or huddle against the cold. They moved as shadows sliding over a white canvas, silent, coordinated, and deadly. In just a handful of days, they had become something fundamentally different from what they were before. Far from the fortress, deep in the jagged mountains, another story unfolded in darkness. A cave mouth guarded by 2 hulking orcs gaped in the cliffside. Their breath steamed in foul clouds, tusks yellow and cracked, bodies looming like grotesque statues carved from flesh. Inside, prisoners from Luna huddled together in the freezing gloom. The air was suffocating, a mix of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and the sour stench of fear. An orc stomped into the chamber and announced, with cruel satisfaction, that Graxar had captured Lunar Fortress and Arcadia now lay practically in orc hands. His harsh laughter echoed along the walls, grinding what remained of the prisoners' hope into dust. Among them sat Gyro, a guardian knight of Luna, who had once rushed ahead against orders to attack the orcs on his own. His armor was gone, his status stripped away, replaced with rags and bruises. He felt as though the world had collapsed around him. Every breath hurt. He blamed himself for everything. The loss of his men, the fall of his homeland. In his mind, he had pushed Luna off a cliff with his own hands. That self-hatred was a weight heavier than chains. Without warning, the orc tossed something into the cell. A human hand landed on the floor with a sickening sound. Pale fingers stiff and curled. The orc called them slaves and told them to eat if they wanted to live. Then he left, closing the door with a dull final thud, sealing them once more in the dark. Quiet curses and choked whispers spread among the prisoners. Their anger had no teeth. Hunger and cold had dulled even their defiance. Then Gyro stood. He walked toward the severed hand, not with hesitation but with a strange, deliberate calm. The others watched, expecting him to give in, to accept the orc's humiliating terms, just to stay alive. Instead, he picked up the hand, sat facing the door, and began pulling away the flesh. His eyes held a cold, frightening clarity. When his comrades asked what he was doing, he answered simply, even if he died here, he would take some of the enemy with him. There was no madness in his tone, only resolve. He stripped the flesh and began grinding the exposed bone against the floor, shaping it into a jagged point. The scraping sound echoed like a grim rhythm in the cave, morbid and steady. The others stared, caught between horror and awe, as their fallen knight reshaped his despair into a weapon. As he worked, Gyro's thoughts spiraled through every choice he had made. He wondered if, had he waited for the 30 reinforcements from Dmitry instead of charging ahead, things might have turned out differently. Could those unknown warriors have saved Luna before everything collapsed? He answered himself with bitter logic. Dmitry owed them nothing. They had no deep alliance, no shared history. Why would a distant lord sacrifice his own limited forces for a kingdom that had already been consumed by war? From the start, he concluded, there had never been any real hope. He felt abandoned not just by other nations, but by the heavens themselves. They had once fought to protect their continent, and now they were being thrown away like scraps. He remembered in some quiet internal space the question he had once asked the gods. What did they want from Luna? Why did those who had sacrificed everything end up suffering the most? No answer came, only cold and silence. He exhaled, a soft, resigned sigh that hung briefly in the frigid air. His fingers tightened around the sharpened bone. He accepted one final truth. His life as a snowfield swordsman was over. He would never again wield the polished steel that had once defined him. Now there was only this crude shard and the last flicker of his will. Gyro moved to the side of the doorway, pressing himself into the shadows. If this was to be his end, he decided it would not be as a helpless victim. He would die facing the enemy as a human, not as an animal waiting for slaughter. Heavy footsteps approached from outside, vibrating through the stone. The latch lifted. The door began to swing inward. Gyro sprang forward with everything he had left. Bone shard aimed for the throat of the first silhouette that appeared. The tip stopped a breath away from Caden's neck. Both men froze, eyes wide with shock. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between that sharpened bone and Caden's skin. Gyro's chest heaved, his heart pounding like it was trying to escape his ribs. Caden stared back, just as stunned, because both of them had believed the other to be dead. Words stumbled at the threshold of their lips and then fell away, leaving only stunned silence. Then motion returned to the world. Caden's rescue squad flooded the chamber with purposeful speed, unshackling prisoners and helping them to their feet. Orders were given in quick, sharp whispers. Bodies moved, chains clattered, and the long-dead hope in the prisoners' eyes flickered back to life. Caden, guiding them out through the snow and stone, moved with a grace and certainty he hadn't possessed before Luna's fall. His steps scarcely disturbed the ice. He had learned, in his own way, to walk the same path Roman was carving. Gyro stumbled along, still struggling to believe what was happening. In his mind, Luna should already have been wiped from the map. Everything he knew about how the world worked told him this moment was impossible. Yet here he was, alive, walking out of a prison he had accepted as his tomb. Caden turned to him with an energy that warmed even the frozen air. He told Gyro to pull himself together. The war, he said, was not over yet. There was a spark in his gaze that hadn't existed before meeting Roman, a flame borrowed from a greater fire. Gyro managed to ask what Caden meant, his voice raw. Caden answered with a faint, almost boyish smile. Dmitry's forces had crushed the orcs, and Luna Fortress had been reclaimed. Gyro's world tilted. The idea that 30 foreign warriors had accomplished what he believed impossible felt like a miracle. His eyes filled and overflowed, hot tears carving clean lines through the dirt on his face before freezing in the cold. The crushing guilt that had been suffocating him loosened its grip. Luna hadn't died because of him. The homeland he loved had survived. He looked around, searching for the man whose name now carried that miracle, Roman Dmitry. He wanted to thank him, to bow, to apologize for ever doubting that salvation could come. He wanted to see the face of the commander who had turned the tide with so little and changed the fate of his kingdom. Far above, on a small cliff overlooking the valley and the freed prisoners, stood a solitary figure. Roman watched everything silently, sword at his side, cloak fluttering in the cruel wind. Snow swirled around him, but he remained mute and still, eyes scanning the distance for threats that might yet appear. He did not descend to stand among the cheering captives. He did not wait to receive their gratitude or bask in their praise. This, to him, was not the end. Only one step on a path soaked in snow and blood. From his vantage point, Roman observed the kingdom he had claimed and the people he had begun to reshape, a lone sentinel facing whatever storm would come next. Snow fell without mercy across the frozen expanse of Arcadia, each flake another layer in an endless burial shroud that seemed determined to swallow the world whole. The continent had become a realm of eternal winter, where survival itself was an act of defiance. Somewhere deep within that white wasteland, near the borders of elven territory, the silence of the snow was shattered by the roar of war. What had once been pristine, untouched landscape was now stained with the chaotic colors of battle, dark crimson spreading across the white canvas like ink spilled on paper. The orcs had come in numbers that seemed endless, a tide of green muscle and iron crashing against the walls of the elven fortress. High above on the stone ramparts, elven archers stood with pale faces, their expressions carved from desperation and exhaustion. Their fingers bled from pulling bowstrings, loosing arrow after arrow into the horde below. Each shaft found its mark, but still the enemy surged forward. The elves knew with terrible clarity that if those gates fell, everything they loved would be consumed. So they held their ground, breath hitching in frozen lungs, watching the massacre unfold beneath them with hearts heavy as stone. Below the towering fortress walls, the battlefield had descended into something worse than chaos. It had become a slaughterhouse. At the center of that carnage stood Graxar, the orc lord of the Grey Wasteland tribe, moving through elven soldiers with terrifying efficiency. His massive blade rose and fell in brutal rhythm, cleaving through armor and bone as easily as a farmer's scythe through grain. Each swing left another body crumpled in the blood-stained snow. Around him flickered a faint crimson aura, pulsing with malice and hunger, a visual promise of the devastation he carried in every strike. His presence alone was enough to drain the courage from those who faced him. He stood over the corpse of a freshly killed soldier and laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed off the stone walls. He mocked the elves, calling them pathetic, asking if they truly thought their frail bodies could stop him. The remaining foot soldiers trembled where they stood, legs shaking, hands white-knuckled around their spears. They were trapped between duty to their homeland and the primal terror radiating from the orc lord. An elf archer on the wall gritted his teeth, eyes stinging from wind and the sight of slaughter below. Watching the red aura twist around Graxar's form, he realized with sinking dread that this was the legendary warlord himself, Graxar of the Grey Wasteland. Then, cutting through the rhythm of Graxar's dominance, an orc soldier came sprinting toward him, face twisted in panic. He shouted that there was a surprise attack. Humans were striking from the rear. Graxar's mind raced. The only human stronghold in the region, Lunar Fortress, had already been captured. He had crushed them himself. The humans were supposed to be broken, scattered, leaderless, so who could possibly be launching a counterattack now? The information didn't make sense, and that uncertainty clawed at the edges of his confidence. Far behind the orcish lines, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Kevin moved through the deep snow with unnatural grace, his eyes sharp and focused, scanning the battlefield like a hawk searching for prey. He wasn't trudging or struggling, he was gliding, his movements so fluid it seemed as though the snow itself was bending to his will. He was using Seelin's martial arts, the technique Dmitry had taught them before their march. It was a discipline that allowed warriors to harmonize with the frozen environment, to become one with the blizzard rather than fight against it. Kevin and the other Dmitry soldiers appeared seemingly from nowhere, their silhouettes materializing out of the white storm like vengeful spirits. They struck without warning, blades flashing in the pale light, cutting down orcs with surgical precision before vanishing back into the swirling snow. The orcs at the rear turned at the sound of screams, just in time to see their comrades fall and the attackers disappear as if they had never existed. There were no footprints, no trails. The snow remained smooth and untouched where the humans had stood moments before. The surviving orcs stared in disbelief, a creeping dread settling over them. These weren't the weak, desperate humans they had expected. These were something else entirely. Warriors from beyond the endless mountain range, perhaps, or spirits given flesh. A sense of unease spread through the orcish ranks like poison in water. Moments later, the Dmitry soldiers struck again, emerging from the blizzard to kill several more orcs before vanishing once more. Watching from a distance, the lunar warriors, men who had struggled just to survive the snow, looked on in stunned amazement. They had never seen humans fight like this. It was as if the storm itself had taken their side. From a cliff overlooking the valley, Roman Dmitry watched the battle with cold, calculating eyes. Every movement below was a piece on a board he had already studied. He could see the flaw in Graxar's formation clearly. Because the fortress had fallen and the orcs believed Luna was defeated, they had placed all their elite troops at the front. Their rear was exposed, vulnerable, manned by weaker forces who never expected an attack. That arrogance was their greatest weakness. Roman stood with his cloak billowing in the wind and issued his orders. The Dmitry forces would continue their hit-and-run tactics, and the lunar soldiers would join them to execute every orc they could reach. By striking the rear, where power wasn't concentrated, they could reverse the numerical disadvantage and throw the enemy into chaos. The plan was simple, brutal, and effective. Below, Graxar roared in fury when news of the falling rear guard reached him. His rage was a physical force, boiling over as he realized his momentum was being disrupted. He screamed orders for the orcs to turn around and crush the pests at their back. Seeing the orcs react exactly as predicted, Roman allowed himself a faint, cold smile. He raised his hand with deliberate calm and gave the signal for the second phase of his plan. Desperate to regain control, the orcs mounted their snarling wolves and charged toward the rear, claws digging into ice as the beasts lunged forward. They funneled into a narrow mountain pass, the terrain forcing their formation to tighten and compress. As they entered the narrowest section of the pass, Roman's second operation began. Luna and Dmitry's soldiers ambushed them from both sides, emerging from the shadows of the cliffs in a perfectly timed pincer movement. Rocks tumbled, blades swung, and the orcs, trapped in the cramped space, were helpless. Many were cut down in moments. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the human forces vanished again, using the North Sea Ice Palace's stealth techniques to melt back into the blizzard. The orcs cursed and bellowed, their wolves snapping at empty air. They tried to chase, tried to find tracks, but the wind had already erased every sign. The snow swirled and covered all evidence instantly. The remaining orcs moved forward again, but this time with caution. Eyes darting toward every shadow and snowbank, the confidence they had carried now replaced by wariness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the lunar soldiers watching from their positions felt relief bloom in their chests. Hope, fragile but real, flickered to life. They praised Seelan's martial arts openly, marveling at the technique Roman Dmitry had shared with them. That a human could possess such knowledge and that he would teach it freely to foreigners seemed almost miraculous. They whispered among themselves, wondering if Roman was something more than mortal. Behind the front lines, Graxar heard the commotion and turned, nostrils flaring as he scented the air. His instincts told him the enemy commander was no ordinary warrior. He could feel a strong aura somewhere in the distance, something vast and ominous, like a mountain hidden in mist. Were these strangers truly from beyond the endless range? Whoever they were dismantling his army piece by piece. Graxar knew he had to act personally if he wanted to turn the tide. The red aura around his body flared with renewed intensity, violent and oppressive. He appeared at the rear of his own forces with heavy footsteps that shook the ground. He ordered his troops to step back and not be drawn into the enemy's traps. He saw clearly now what was happening. A series of calculated provocations designed to pull his men into disadvantageous terrain. The orcs, despite their bloodlust, obeyed and cleared a path for their lord. Graxar charged forward, blade raised high, steel reflecting the dull grey sky. His movements seemed reckless, but his intent was focused entirely on drawing out the hidden leader. Then, without warning, a Dmitry soldier burst from the snow and struck at him. It was a bold, desperate move, a blur of motion against the white backdrop. Graxar blocked the swing, and the collision sent a visible shockwave rippling through the mountain, spraying snow in every direction. Graxar's arms trembled from the impact. He was shocked. This was no ordinary foot soldier. The attack had been amplified through perfect timing and use of terrain. The soldier knew he was dancing on the edge of a blade. One mistake, and he would be dead. Their swords clashed again, steel ringing sharp and discordant in the frozen air. Graxar studied the man and assumed he was the human leader. He challenged him to a duel, saying that if the human could defeat him, the Grey Wasteland tribe would admit defeat and withdraw. But then, from somewhere in the distance, a calm voice answered. It was steady, measured, and carried an edge that made the air feel heavier. The voice alone sent a chill down Graxar's spine, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He tightened his grip on his blade and demanded to know who spoke. A question flickered through his mind. Was the warrior before him not the human leader after all? Hearing the voice, the Dmitry soldiers smiled with quiet confidence. A figure emerged slowly from the thick snow, the wind dying just long enough for his silhouette to become clear. It was Roman Dmitry. He walked with a relaxed but predatory gait, eyes locked on the orc lord. As he stepped forward, the soldier who had been fighting Graxar quickly moved aside. Roman came to a stop and asked a simple question. If Graxar wins, What does he think will happen to those who followed Roman? Graxar answered that it would be up to the victor, a low, arrogant snarl. Roman nodded slowly and accepted the proposal, but added a warning. He wanted no misunderstanding about the consequences. If Roman won, he said, he would exterminate every orc who had used humans as food. His expression hardened into something terrifyingly absolute. He wasn't talking about winning a battle. He was talking about erasing orcs from the continent of Arcadia entirely. Graxar flared in rage, his pride wounded by the human's arrogance. He clutched his blade until his knuckles turned white and swore that if he won, he would trample Roman's homeland into dust. Without another word, both warriors swung their swords with full force. The collision was cataclysmic. A ripple of energy tore through the mountain range, sparks exploding from the clash of steel, bright enough to momentarily blind those watching. The sound was like thunder trapped in a canyon. Roman deflected Graxar's attack with fluid precision, guiding the orc's momentum away until the massive blade buried itself deep in the frozen ground. Graxar pushed himself to the limit, muscles bulging as he wrenched his weapon free. Their blades met again and again, sparking and ringing across the entire mountain range. They moved at terrifying speed, a dance of death almost too fast for the eye to follow. With every exchange, Roman's attacks grew harder for Graxar to handle. Each strike felt like being hit by a falling star. Graxar's mind reeled. He couldn't believe he was being pushed back by a human. He had spent his life crushing men beneath his heel, yet this man was different, stronger, faster, and utterly relentless. As their swords ground together once more, Roman asked mockingly if that was the best Graxar could do. His voice was steady, as if he weren't in the middle of a life-or-death struggle. Graxar roared and charged his aura even further, drawing upon every last drop of his strength. His body and blade glowed with crimson light so intense it turned the surrounding snow into a bloody mist. He questioned inwardly how such a monster could exist among humans. He had always seen humans as prey, weak and fragile, but Roman Dmitry was a predator of a much higher order, something beyond mortal limits. Roman decided to end it. He shifted his stance, and the pressure around him changed, becoming something ancient and overwhelming. He channeled the heavenly demon sword art, a technique that transcended the boundaries of mortal swordsmanship. With a single devastating stroke, he cut down the Orc Lord who had terrorized the entire continent of Arcadia. As Graxar fell, the crimson aura around him vanished like smoke. The only sounds left were the whistling of the wind and the soft, final thud of his body hitting the snow. The Orc Lord was dead. The silence that followed was profound. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a world that had just shifted on its axis. Graxar, the nightmare that had haunted Arcadia's frozen north, lay motionless in the snow. His reign of terror had ended not with a prolonged struggle, but with a single, perfect strike. Roman stood over the corpse, sword still in hand, his expression as cold and unreadable as the mountains around him. The soldiers, both Dmitry and Luna, stared in stunned silence, witnessing the fall of a legend and the rise of something even greater.